Welcome to this Baptist News Global webinar. Here's your host, Mark Wingfield.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome. I need to begin the webinar today by giving you a content warning that we want to advise you that much of the narrative of the book we're going to be talking about today involves a brutal sexual assault and the aftermath of that. That incident will be referred to multiple times in the presentation, both through summaries and quotations that are given in the trial and in interviews and so forth. So just be aware, if this is something that's triggering for you, to know that that is a major part of the content here. We just want you to know that up front in case you've walked in not knowing what the content of the book is. And this is the beautiful book that I'm not only highly recommending, but we're going to talk about in detail here during this time. And toward the end of the session, we'll have time for some Q&A with the authors as well. And I'm sure it's not coincidental that the cover of the book is green and gold. That didn't get past my sharp mind, at least.
João would have you know that's also the colors of the Brazilian football team, I believe.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Coincidentally, I guess, but that is correct.
Beautiful coincidence, right? Right. Okay. Well, let's begin, and rather than me rattle on, let's just get each of our authors to introduce yourself briefly. Go in whatever order you want to go in.
I'm Mikeal Parsons. I teach in the Department of Religion at Baylor. My area of expertise is actually biblical studies and New Testament, but I have on occasion ventured outside my expertise, as is the case with this book.
Beautiful.
I'm João Chaves. I also teach at the Department of Religion at Baylor. I'm a historian by training, but I should tell you that Mike's being modest. He is very much an excellent historian, and it was a joy to work with him and learn from him in this process of collaboration here.
And Dr. Chaves is new to the Baylor faculty this academic year, correct?
That is correct. Previously, it was at Princeton Theological Seminary and Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary, and this is my first month, actually. Officially, I started August 1st here at Baylor.
Okay, and you published a book about the university's sordid history just as you arrived. That's nice. So, and that's actually one of the things I wanted to ask you all about up front. So first of all, the book is riveting. The story's riveting. It's astonishing and yet so relevant. But here is a book that delves way back into the history of a revered Baptist institution that you both actually work for, which seems to be, any difficulty with that connection? Writing about your own institution?
Not yet, but maybe this webinar will surface some of those.
Sorry if I gave anyone that idea.
Some of those issues.
Okay, yeah.
No, the university has actually been so far very supportive. We received a grant from the University Research Committee that enabled João to make several trips to Brazil to examine archives and do some interviews. We're also able to employ some forensic medical experts to examine the medical testimony. So to this point, the institution, Mark, the impetus for the book actually began at the invitation of President Lyndon Livingstone after the murder of George Floyd in 2020. A lot of institutions began institutional reckoning with their entanglements with race relations, and in the case of Baylor, with chattel slavery at its origins. I got interested in that story. That's why it goes so far back. And Dr. Livingstone appointed, as you know, a commission to examine the historic monuments on the campus, really as a way of bringing into the light our history, I think, in order to shape a better future. So I got interested in what was going on. Our chair, Doug Weaver, was on that commission, and I just started digging around. And I've been at Baylor a very long time, and I had never heard the story of Antonia Teixeira. And so when I discovered that there was this story of a young woman who was a student at Baylor living in the home of President and Mrs. Burleson, a native of Brazil, who was sexually assaulted while living there by the brother to President Burleson's son-in-law, and realizing that she had connections to, Brazilian Baptists, I asked João, who is a historian of that area and region, and a very fine one, if he had heard of Antonia Teixeira. And he said to me, no, but I know Antonio Teixeira, her father, it turns out. And so I realized then that in order to tell this story, which I thought was part of the initiative given by the Board of Regents and President Livingstone to sort of come to terms with our past, that we needed to go back and tell that part of the story as well. And it turns out I knew nothing about that aspect of it. Of course, here in Waco, the beginnings of the Baptist mission in Brazil is well known and revered, but there are aspects of that story that had not been told, and I think Drow in the first half of this book tells that story really well. So that's how we ended up doing the work together and putting the two halves. So we, in order to understand Antonia's story, we felt like we needed to understand that of her family, especially her father.
That's so beautiful. Let me just make sure the listeners understand. It's a bit confusing because you have two characters whose names differ by one letter. The father, Antonio, and the daughter, Antonia. And those two characters frame two different parts of the story, right? And the thing that immediately struck me as fascinating, the opening of the book, where you're describing the what's it called, the Cotton Palace in Waco. What a riveting scene. This could be a movie, it's just really to take us back into that time and what a big deal that was. And I did, living in Dallas, chuckle at the rivalry between Waco and Dallas.
Waco lost.
But, Waco's better than it used to be. So anyhow. So
let me just say that, yes, it's the difference in gender between Antonio and Antonia, right. But in the newspaper reports and a lot of the accounts, Antonia is often referred to with the masculine name, and that's part of the confusion in the primary sources.
Right, I can see that. Okay, so I think Dr. Chaves, your original work on this, when we talked some time ago, was looking into the history of Baptist mission work in Brazil.
That's right. So my previous book's called The Global Mission of the Jim Crow South, and it deals with Southern Baptist missionaries in Brazil and their dynamics with locals and how that developed. But I did not spend a lot of time with Antonio. So Mike is correct. When he reached out about Antonia, I said, no, I never heard of her. And as you might have found out from the book, Mark, we argue that erasure of her memory has a level of intentionality. As a matter of fact, if you read Antonio's official biography in Portuguese, the biographer knows that there is a firstborn, but she doesn't even know her name, so she just calls her firstborn.
Wow.
Which is and we talk a little bit about that on the book. So there was a work of uncovering there that we had to do. As Mike mentioned, that was strongly supported by Baylor University, or the grant that the university gave us, which is an institution that I am also deeply connected to, because I now return to it, but a graduate twice graduate of Baylor. So it's an uncomfortable story, and a story that needs to be told, but we tell that of people who also have deep appreciation for the institution in many different levels. As a matter of fact, we dedicate the book to administrators, faculty, and students of the school, many of whom would celebrate that these kinds of stories are coming out so that we can reckon with some of the institutional ghosts or skeletons that need to be dealt with.
Well, thank you. It's lovely to hear that. And I know that the president has had this initiative to deal with the historical founding and so forth. But we can't understand this story without understanding the beginning of Southern Baptist missions in Brazil. And I mean, I grew up Southern Baptist. I was a royal ambassador. I heard all the stories. All the missionaries are heroes, and we can't discount. There's been a lot of good that's happened through mission work in Brazil, but the motive for that was, it turns out, wasn't as pure as the gospel itself.
Right, and I mean that is a high aspiration, right? To have motives that fully match the message of the gospel. We're always kind of, in some ways, negotiating our human dispositions with the higher aspirations of the gospel message. And we can know that's a whole conversation in itself, right? How do we disentangle all cultural and embodied dispositions from what we claim are divine and holy and all of that, right? Or some of us anyway. So I did some of that work in that book that you mentioned, The Global Mission of the Jim Crow South, in some ways looking at how missionaries, Southern Baptist missionaries in particular in Brazil, did not live up to the message they preached, right? And so it's a very complicated story in itself, and part of that story connects with Antônia. So here we in this book we took a different direction of that same story, which is the story of the Confederate exiles that leave the South to Brazil. Thousands of them go, and this is really where the sustainable phase of Southern Baptist missions in Brazil begin. Among Confederate enclaves in Brazil, where there are Southern Baptists, Southern Presbyterians, Southern Methodists, that starts communities there in their cultural enclaves in the country. And it is in one of those enclaves that Antônio Teixeira, Antonia's father, meets with missionaries, and we tell that story in the book as well. Eventually, William Buck Bagby and Zachary Taylor are among those former Confederates in one of those enclaves in Santa Barbara specifically. They get to meet Antônio and develop a relationship. Antônio originally is a language instructor, and then his role continues to grow. And they leave that enclave and go to start churches in Bahia and then in Rio, and the story starts there. But so it is at the very beginning there, Antônio being the first Brazilian-born Baptist pastor who encounters the Bagbys and the Taylors as they are being acclimated in the country, receiving the support of these Confederate or exiles, or the enclaves of Confederate exiles that are there in Brazil. So that's where the story begins, and that is where Antônio enters that story. He's already in relationship with one of those enclaves, and then is where he meets the Bagbys and the Taylors, who, as you noted, are taken as towering figures in Brazilian missions, Baptist missions, more generally, especially the Bagbys, who are often framed as almost flawless, did so much good work there. But as you also mentioned very perceptively, Mark, there are also some complications and difficulties there.
Well, and we need to note that the Bagby family still exists in Baptist life today, even in our Cooperative Baptist Fellowship life. So this is not just a distant issue, and let me back up and say two things that you just brushed on that struck me like full in the face in reading the book, being reminded of the anti-Catholic sentiment of the period. I mean, so much of that is, anti-popery, I think is the word that's used there. And then laid on top of that is, again, I'm an old white guy here, and I'm still always juggling race. And so you describe in the book Antonio as being a white person in Brazil. And help me understand those two things.
All right. I'll try to do that concisely. But let me say something before I get to that, Mark. Once you mentioned the continuing presence of the Bagby family, I just want to note that I do understand that that the difficulties and the inconvenient in some ways parts of these stories, the uncomfortable parts of these stories, we did not take that lightly. I'll say this because after the Global Mission of the Jim Crow South came out, and we'll see what happens here with this book, I was contacted by some descendants of some missionaries who were hurt by the story that book tells. And I just want to say that I am sensitive to that. It is a difficult story to tell, and I get that. I think, again, it's a story that needs to be told because you need to grapple with those difficulties, but that is not done in a flippant way or a careless way, or a way that does not consider to an extent that there is an emotional connection to those figures, either through family connections or through an appreciation of what they mean in Baptist history and beyond. So I just want to be careful and mention that. Now, in terms of the race aspect, I'll say a couple of things. First, the race itself is a contextual, social creation in some ways, right? So, whereas in the U.S., race is understood by hypodescent, right, by heritage. You often think about a person's race based on, again, a person's heritage, the one drop rule. Some people refer that to. Whereas in Brazil, race has become defined more regarding phenotype. That is, if you look a certain way, you are racialized in that particular way, generally speaking. That is one aspect of when you talk about white Brazilians, people who are considered to be white in Brazil, in that context, it is in some ways recognizing the contextuality of race, which involves an aspect of self-understanding and of the way in which race is imagined in a particular context, right? So all things considered, Antonio was a white Brazilian who was seen as white by other Brazilians. So that is one aspect of that story. Another aspect is that missionaries themselves, even if they do not give white Brazilians, they do not imagine white Brazilians or Brazilians who would be considered as whites in Brazil as being equal. They nevertheless had a spectrum of racial identity, in which people who they could perceive as being of pure European stock, they will often use that language, would be higher in that spectrum. And in the other side of the spectrum, in general, were Afro-Brazilians or Black Brazilians, right? So even if these Southern Baptist missionaries could not imagine Antonio as white, in their racial spectrum, he still had the upper hand, as other white Brazilians did, for being in the side of the spectrum that was closer to pure European heritage. So when I mention Antonio's race, I think it's important to mention that. And here, the two perhaps important takeaways are that he is considered differently and more positively than many other Brazilians were by the missionaries, but also folks like Antonio, white Brazilians, were very much also socialized in racialized ways in which they had very noticeable privileges, right? The missionaries certainly had racial biases and imagined race differently, but what we do not want to suggest is that they exported racism to Brazil. Brazil was already a deeply racist society. As a matter of fact, part of the attraction for former Confederates to go to Brazil is that Brazil was a slave-holding country until 1888, was the last one to abolish slavery. So we're not suggesting that they are exporting racism writ large. They have their own racial biases, their own racial imagination. They do bring that with them. But white Brazilians, or Brazilians who are seen as white in Brazil, are often very ready to capitalize on their racial privilege too, right? So I think it's important to recognize that. Is that helpful?
Oh, yeah, very, very helpful. Yeah, thank you. Before we get back to Dr. Parsons, say a word about the anti-Catholicism of the day. And, then that might also connect back to, I mean, certainly in Texas Baptist life in that era, really up through the election of John F. Kennedy, Texas Baptists are very anti-Catholic as well.
Right. No, that is the case in Brazil. In some ways, I don't mean to overstate this, but I think in some ways, the whole Protestant missionary endeavor in Latin America, it's rooted on the assumption that Catholics are not as Christian as they can be, at the least, right? Because they are going to a predominantly Catholic country, to articulate even the need for a mission there in some ways, that articulation itself is founded on different levels of anti-Catholicism. So that definitely is there. It should also be mentioned that the anti-Catholicism is then fed by anti-Protestant violence on part of Catholic leaders. So if there was anti-Catholicism before the missionaries arrived, or that in some ways undergirds and underwrites the Protestant missionary enterprise itself, that gets strengthened with a Protestant missionary groups and then local converts. There are a religious minority that in some ways have anti-Protestant violence inflicted upon them. So it's a complicated issue in the sense that anti-Catholicism is there, but it expresses itself initially as a minority religion that does not have the power to throw its weight around in the way in which it has in places like the US, for example. So it's a little more complicated than that. The anti-Catholicism gets exacerbated by actual violent, anti-Protestant violence that happens too. So it complicates that a little bit and it strengthens it in that particular context.
Okay, so let's move the story forward here. So out of that context, how is it that Rufus Burleson gets involved in this story? What's the connecting point, and how does Antonia end up in Waco?
Okay, well, let me talk about that. Let me just back up for those people who haven't read the book and just make sure everybody understands that Antonio was a Catholic priest. I don't know that we actually said that. I mean,
right.
You know that he was a Catholic priest who left the priesthood, which of course makes him a kind of poster child for the Protestants and especially the Baptists, because look, we've got this Catholic priest. That also means that he's probably better educated than the Baptist missionaries because he's gone to seminary, he knows the languages, etc. And I think part of that first part of the book, we want to uncover the fact that without Antonia Teixeira, the Baptist mission in Brazil would not have been nearly as successful. I mean, he's doing a lot of the preaching because he's got the language skills. He also has a sordid past because he has eventually married. Well, Drow, you should tell that part of the story about the kidnap, because I think we should at least fill that part of the story out, because Antonio has this past that itself gets covered up in the telling by the Southern Baptist missionaries. Just fill that out, Drow, before I go on to that.
Yeah, that's right. So Antonio has his own sexual scandal. In some ways, is framed as the perpetrator, whereas Antonia, in Brazil, that happens here. So he kidnaps the person who becomes presumably Antonia's mother. She was 17 years old, and he was in his 30s. After performing mass, they leave his hometown and go back to another town within the northeastern region of Brazil, to Recife. So he's very much embattled by that, because it becomes a public figure, because at the time that this happens, there is a very public dispute between the Catholic leaders and the Brazilian government that hinges over mensory. They then use the story of Antonio to be part of a representation of the fact that some Catholic leaders are corrupt, right? So he becomes, in some ways, or is framed as this archetype of Catholic corruption because of this national debate and this national dispute that is happening in Brazil. Later on, he's going to capitalize. He capitalizes on that when he converts to Protestantism, and he says that like Mike suggested, he uses that as this as a superiority of Roman of the Baptist faith in relationship to Roman Catholicism. And at that point, it is really clear that you have two different kind of accounts of Antonio's conversion. The Catholic account is he just converted because he found a way to get married with the person he kidnapped several years ago. So it's a character flaw that he has. It's not a theological distinction. He just now has the Protestants to religiously legitimize his failing character. And the Protestant account of that is that he read the Bible and he believed the Bible and thus became a Baptist. That's simplified a bit, but that's kind of the account. And it's interesting that when the missionaries tell the story of Antonio, their Catholic accounts in his previous past never comes in. So uncovering that is part of the research we could do with the money from the Brown Fund, that I had to go to Brazil and look at and dig in all of that. But all is in some ways is very public. These disputes and these debates are happening in newspapers throughout the country. He really becomes a national figure that has this infamous past. He's considered the apostate with this character flaw that had to leave the church because he was already a bad priest anyway, on one hand, and then Protestants want to say it was his belief in the Bible, and he produces a series of tracts that begin to consolidate as the years goes by, called The 3 Reasons Why I Left the Roman Catholic Church, that becomes a hit not only for Baptists, but for different Protestants that want to use Antonio, a former priest, as this who writes these anti-Catholic pamphlets, very skilled polemicists in this way, as this representation or this proof of the superiority of Protestantism to Roman Catholicism. So it's again a very public figure, and a very important one for the history of Protestantism in Brazil in general. And again, he connects with some of the missionaries, but he dies very soon after he becomes a Baptist. And then it is when he dies that the missionaries bring Antonia to the United States, and then enters Burleson and the story of the sexual abuse in Waco.
Okay.
So I'll pick it up there. So Antonio dies in 1887, and the family is, and there are many children, 5, 6 children, is basically destitute. And so Zachary Taylor writes and asks that part of the salary that the Foreign Mission Board had been giving to Antonia would continue. In 1891 or so, Kate Taylor, who was T.P. Crawford's niece, I believe, was diagnosed with a tumor in her thigh. It grew to the size of a grapefruit, and they had to bring her back for surgery. So when they came back to the U.S. in January or so of 1892, they brought Antonia with them. Now, interestingly, when Zachary Taylor writes his autobiography, he never mentions that Antonia was with them. But we have the ship manifest that lists her as a servant. So they came to the U.S., they came to New York, they went to Philadelphia. Kate had surgery. She had her leg amputated at the hip. She was also pregnant at the time. It was a very risky, dangerous surgery. In fact, so much so that the doctor who performed it wrote a pamphlet about the surgery. They came to Belton, Texas, to convalesce. And Zachary Taylor had written President Burleson asking if Antonia could enroll as a student at the Baylor Academy. They really went from elementary up through college. And Burleson allowed her to come. She lived in the Burleson household. In exchange for going to classes, she was basically the housekeeper. And after she was there for 2 years, she actually took fewer and fewer classes and spent more and more time doing housekeeping. In November of 1894, you mentioned the Cotton Palace opening. She was sexually assaulted by, as I mentioned, Steen Morris, who was the brother to S.L. Morris, who had married the Burleson's daughter. And she was actually sexually assaulted on several occasions. She says in the trial that she told Georgia Burleson. Mrs. Burleson denied having been told that. A reporter saw her in the spring of 1895 and saw that she was pregnant and interviewed her. And so this story broke. It wasn't that Antonia was trying to bring the story to the surface. She was interviewed. Burleson was also interviewed as part of this newspaper report. Steen Morris was arrested. There was an examining trial. That's what we have the documentation from, in which we have Antonia's own words. Maybe I could just read a paragraph from her testimony.
Yeah, and it's stunning to me, the specificity and the clarity with which she spoke.
And in the book, as you know, she gives testimony. She's given an interview with the Waco paper, and there's a remarkable consistency in her testimony, which adds, I think, credibility to it. This is what she says. So this is the night of the opening of the Cotton Palace, where the Burlesons had gone. Everybody had gone to the opening of the Cotton Palace. At about 9 o'clock, the defendant came to the kitchen door, which was shut. I heard someone walking around outside and opened the door to see who it was, and saw it was the defendant, Steen Morris. He was about 6 feet from the door and asked me to come out then, when I refused to do. He then took me by the arm and pulled me out. He threw me on the ground and got on top of me. He said when he dragged me out there, he was not going to hurt me. He just got on top of me, pulled my clothes up, stayed on me about 10 minutes, and when he quit, I was all bleeding in my privates. He entered my private organ with his male member. He penetrated me. He hurt me, but did not hurt me very bad this time. It made me bleed, but not a great deal. And then he goes on to describe it in some detail. She goes back and tells Mrs. Burleson's mother, Mrs. Jenkins, or she's asleep in the house, and she tells Mrs. Burleson the next day.
He actually had drugged her. Sorry? He actually had drugged her somehow as part of this too, right?
Yes. In another account, he had given her a white drug to drink, and that had dulled her senses. So that happens again. It happened in November, happened again in December. There are 3 times when she's assaulted. The examining trial ends abruptly. on a Saturday morning when the defendant's lawyers, Captain Blair, who was a very well-known lawyer at the time, goes to a different judge with a habeas corpus writ, and the judge basically dismisses the case. And it's at that point that W.C. Brand enters the picture. So those who are local to Waco will know the name of, Mark, you surely know W.C. Brand, who's a famous controversial journalist who started the Iconoclast Journal. He moved from San Antonio to Waco. At the height of its circulation, he had 100,000 readers. And he took this case on. He began criticizing the reaction of Burleson and Baylor for not protecting Antonia and rather being more concerned about, Burleson was in a pickle. This is his son-in-law's brother, and this happens in his backyard. This is where all three assaults occur, in the backyard of the president's home, which at the time was located over behind what is now the Catholic Center. And so Brand just won't let them off the hook. And so there's this exchange. The chapter is called War of Words, in which Brand and Burleson are going back and forth. And Burleson issues a pamphlet called The Brazilian Girl in Baylor University, in which he engages in what we would call victim shaming. And he says that she is showing the sins of Brazilians who lie, or they're dishonest, and they can't control their passions. And so this goes back and forth between Brand and Burleson. Burleson himself is in a bit of a compromised situation with his board of trustees. Anyhow, I think because of the exchange and Brand's insistence on keeping this in front of the local, and this story gets picked up throughout Texas. It is the scandal of the decade, if not several decades. And the Galveston paper, Galveston was a huge city at that time, is reporting this and keeping this story going. And so Steen Morris is rearrested and actually put on trial. Antonia is pregnant from this assault. That's how she gives birth to the child prematurely. The child will die the next spring, doesn't live quite to be a year. And there is a trial. And we don't have the documents from that trial, but it basically, I think it rehearsed the examining trial from before, which we have about 20 pages of testimony. You got two doctors who testified. One was the Burleson family doctor, who said she was probably very promiscuous, and that's, we don't know who the father was. The other doctor who actually did a visual as well as a digital exam noticed a laceration, which he attributed to some kind of assault. And we had two forensic medical doctors who've testified in cases here examined that, and they agreed that the testimony clearly suggested that Antonia was a victim of some kind of sexual assault. Doesn't mean that it was Steen Morris, but nobody else actually was ever implicated as that.
Side note here, one of the things that you point out in the book is that the defenders of Steen Morris are saying, well, it was probably that black kid down the way.
Yes.
And she points out, but look, the baby's white.
Right. Well, Brand does that. So then they try to say it's a student at Baylor named Lise Olsberg. And what's interesting is, that trial ends in a hung jury. 7 say Steen Morris is guilty, 5 said not. So they're going to retry in the fall. So this was in May of 1896. They're going to retry it. And interestingly, it is the state who wants to call Lise Olsberg, because they think he's going to testify he had nothing to do with Antonia. It wasn't the defense who's calling him, which I think is an interesting detail as well. Sometime in the fall, Antonia signs an affidavit in which she recants her testimony. And the next day, she's on a train and has left town. We lost her trail at that point. Brand said that she'd gone to Memphis. In fact, she did go to Memphis. at the invitation of a baker named James Stratton. And you know the intrigue about that. We don't know why she went to Memphis other than she goes to meet this guy who then abandons her. And she ends up in the hospice of the Good Shepherd for unwed fallen women, as it were. And then she basically disappears. Bran says she's going to be erased from the face of the earth. We have evidence that she did marry at some point, which also corroborates what Antonio's biographer had said, but we lose the trail of her. So the trustees at the annual meeting of the Texas Baptist Convention are concerned because Bran has said, don't send your daughters to Baylor, it's not safe. And so they are one of the themes of the book is this and it's understandable, the intention to preserve this notion of institutional goodness. Baylor's a good place. In order to do that, they really have to scandalize Antonia. And so she's left, as Bran says, all of the church people are protecting Baylor, and it's all of the skeptics, unbelievers, etc., who've put their money together to provide a defense for Antonia. So it's a very sad, tragic, really, story. Eventually, and we do very little with this in the book, but this is what there are historical markers in Waco about this. There are gun duels between a supporter of a judge named Big Sandy, ends up killing the editor of the Waco paper and his brother in a gun duel. Bran himself, who had gone too far perhaps in saying, don't send your daughters to Baylor, or just make Mary Magdalenes of them, etc. He gets into a gunfight with a Baylor supporter named Tom Davis. They both shoot each other and both die. And of course, later Burleson himself is going to step down from the presidency, perhaps partly because of his involvement in this, not necessarily because he didn't do the right thing by Antonia, but because he couldn't handle Bran's criticisms. So that's sort of the story in a nutshell.
Okay, so let me move us forward and ask this question that I think is the key to it today. Why is this story relevant to us today? Why should we care about this story in 2023?
Well, I'll give a shot at that, and then João can as well. I think institutions are constantly faced with temptations. How do you deal with your past? How do you deal with your present? And long ago, Reinhold Niebuhr talked about moral man and immoral society. The impulses of individuals, I think, are to do the right thing, but there's always a tension between doing what is best for the institution, and sometimes we do what we think is best for the institution in harmful ways to those who are most vulnerable among us. And so I think that's a constant challenge to us. We saw it. I stumbled onto this story because of something in the Texas Monthly that was written comparing Antonia's story to the football scandal from a few years ago, where we lost our coach and our president because of these attempts to, however you view that. So that's not going to go away, seems to me. And, as you say, as an old white guy, I'm constantly asking myself, what would I have done? I mean, I would like to think I would have, been on the side of Antonia, but would I have? I mean, those are the kinds of questions one has to ask when you're in positions of privilege and power. How do you use that privilege and power that is beneficial to everybody? And
the people who were supporting Steen Morris were basically the Chamber of Commerce of Waco and the donors to Baylor. I mean, it was the people who matter. This just can't be. This can't be. Right?
And it was to preserve the institution at whatever cost.
Yeah, Dr. Chaves.
Yeah, no, I will say a version of that. I agree with what Mike said, but But I think that one of the things that hopefully is a takeaway from the book moving forward is a graphic reminder that institutional myth making is often at odds with care for vulnerable people, and we need to pay attention to that.
Mm. That's institutional myth making often is at odds with vulnerable people. That's what, yeah, that is, that, yeah, very good. Well, in the a little bit of time we have left, I want to open this up. If you've got a question, we've got 34 participants on here right now. Drop a question in the Q&A, and I'll feed those here in the little bit of time we have left. While we're waiting on those questions to come in, let me ask each of you, how has learning this story helped you, changed you, challenged you? How are you different for having researched and written this book?
Go ahead, João. I took the other one first.
Yeah, I mean, is very well. I think the whole story was deeply disturbing. It reminds. I mean, the reminder that I mentioned is a reminder that I myself need too, right? That this institutional myth making can be a dangerous thing, and I think that. I continue to struggle, as I did with previous work and with this one also, to think about and map my own qualified belongings in these two countries in which I live, right? Brazil, in the U.S., being a Baptist myself. So I think that I think that one of the things that I continue to figure out is how to account for that belonging within that narrative, and to what extent I want to frame my identity within that complex, complicated narrative. So I think that that's one of the things I could say about that.
Yeah.
I also found it disturbing at very, very many different levels. I think the thing that I walked away with is a recommitment to this notion of hospitality that is so important to the Christian tradition, and particularly the Baptist version of hospitality, which in our history from the beginning was to protect the rights of the most vulnerable in society. And I think being more intentional about that as an individual, and also more vigilant about it as an institution, to make sure that we don't let the myth making of the institution get in the way of our being hospitable to everybody who comes onto our campus and is part of our life, even if they're very different from ourselves.
Well, and certainly Baylor University today is a dramatically different institution in every imaginable way than it was in the late 19th century. We have a question here. Someone wants to know, the timing is interesting given all the uproar about clergy sexual abuse in the SBC, and wanting to know, do you discuss that connection anywhere in the book or in the epilogue, or if not, what thoughts do you have? Are these things connected in any way?
In the epilogue, we do talk about, and actually in the last chapter, Drow rehearses some of the sexual scandals of missionaries sort of over time. But in the epilogue, the report from the SBC had just been released when we were finishing the book, and we point to that as a way of saying this is not an issue that has gone away, right? It's still very much with us. So that's what I remember from the epilogue. João, did we say anything more than that?
No, I think that's right. It had just come out, and I want to say that it was kind of the first draft was already ready, and then we included that, if memory is correct. But so we do acknowledge that and see and trace some of the connections briefly in the epilogue. So that's right. Thank you, Mike.
As we wind down here, I'd like to, again, if you've not seen the book, this is it. I highly recommend this. That you're going to want to go read it now for sure. Published by Erdmans. I'm curious. Back to the way your project was funded by the institutional desire at Baylor to dig into the past, understand the past at all. How does your project fit into this larger work of, let's call it reconciliation, reckoning, whatever word you want to use, that's happening within Baylor as an institution? How is this a part of that?
Well, we would hope that the work that we did, and we did share this with parts of it was ongoing with the Commission on Historic Representations. And in fact, the story of Antonia is mentioned in the report in a footnote. So we'd like to think that when the decision was made to rename Burleson Quadrangle and to move the statue of Rufus Burleson to a less prominent place, that this might have contributed to that in some way. It's a small step. I would love to see this story historically become something that we could use in sensitizing our students to the history of the institution. You know, Maya Angelou, I think it was, who said, now that we know better, we need to do better. And that kind of is part of the refrain. So I think it does fit into the, and that's one of the reasons we dedicated the book to the administration and regents and faculty who are committed to coming to terms with this past, not just to come to terms with it, but in order to move into a better future for all of us.
Well, if I could add something that's connected to that question, the book is also coming out in Portuguese, hopefully by the end of the year. And this was intentional. We wanted to come out simultaneously. That couldn't happen because of the editing and translation process in the Portuguese version. So there is an intervention to be made there too that I think parallels an intervention to be made here in terms of what you mentioned in the beginning of our conversation, Mark, which is our myth making in terms of the missionary enterprise also. I think there are lots of work to be done there in terms of complexifying that story in ways that might qualify in more sophisticated ways the role of U.S. Protestant missions abroad and what it created and what it helped begin. As I mentioned in a previous work, if you look at to mention the example of Brazil specifically, as the way in which conservative evangelical networks, including the Brazilian Baptist Convention, how that story developed into support for the dictatorship in the 60s, support for right-wing authoritarian folks, now very recently, in some ways connect directly with this missionary enterprise that tells its own myths in ways that covers its footprints, right? That does not acknowledge its own complexity, and it is a very convincing story in some ways because the story, those stories anyway, are disseminated via the means of cultural productions the missionaries control. So I think that aside from the institutional takeaway for Baylor, there is a broader message here in terms of our own understanding on our transnational footprint of missions and how that have developed within networks that inform very important issues that accompany us today.
Well, thank you both. We've reached the end of our time here, and we could talk another hour about this fascinating topic. There are and we've got some other questions that come in, but we had promised to shut this off at the hour mark, and I know y'all have classes to teach and such. Thank you so much. Thank you to all who've joined us. This has been a great participation. This video will be live probably this evening or in the morning on our website, our YouTube channel. Again, here's the book, Remembering Antonia Teixeira. And I hope if you haven't read it, you will. Thanks to both of you. It's great to visit with you. Goodbye to everyone.
Support independent faith-based journalism. Baptist News Global.